Hello, my name is Robert Boxler, and today I'm going to walk you through the refresher course for OSHA Hazard Communication. This is just part of the overall employee safety training program for Akron Public Schools. You're listening to this course today to inform you of hazardous substances in your workplace, instruct you on how to use chemical products safely, and instruct you how to protect yourself. Program components include material safety data sheets and employee training upon hire, transfer, or when new chemical substances are introduced into the workplace. These are parts of federal guidelines required by OSHA that anyone involved with handling dangerous or hazardous substances receive annual refresher training. What are chemical hazards? What is a hazardous substance? How are hazards classified? How can employees become exposed? And what are the effects of the exposure? A chemical product is hazardous if it can harm you or the environment. These are just some terms commonly found on material safety data sheets. Most commonly encountered in the schools are corrosive chemicals and reactive and toxic chemicals. Corrosives, such as acids and bases, typically burn or damage the skin on contact. Explosives generally are not found in the school system, and most are banned on our prohibited chemicals lists. Flammables are quite common in our laboratories and in our maintenance departments. Gasoline, kerosene, many types of alcohols fall into this category. Radioactives. There should not be anything in our school district carrying this symbol. Reactives include many chemicals, including things such as sodium metal that when exposed to air will ignite, burn, or explode. Any chemical that when exposed to something such as water or air that becomes unstable is considered a reactive. Toxic chemicals cover a wide range of chemicals that cover all kinds of poisons and carcinogenic chemicals. Employees and students can be exposed to hazardous chemicals by ingestion, absorption, and inhalation. Ingestion, although not typical, can be accidental via splashing chemicals or by not wearing proper hand protection and getting chemicals on your hands, followed by not washing your hands and going to lunch and passing a chemical onto your food from your hands. Absorption can happen when you're not wearing gloves and getting chemicals on your hands, and can also happen from splashing that could get onto your face and or your arms or hands. Inhalation is the easiest exposure handling dangerous chemicals when you're not using a ventilation hood. All of these methods of exposure need to be paid attention to with every individual chemical, and know which hazard for each chemical you have to be aware of and what safety precautions you have to take. When people are exposed to hazardous chemicals, they typically result in an acute exposure or a chronic exposure. And what is meant by that is acute exposure results in immediate symptoms. Typically, eyes are burning, headaches result immediately. Chronic exposure, however, chronic symptoms could happen days or weeks later after long periods of exposure. Sometimes chronic effects can be more dangerous because people are not aware that they are being exposed to hazardous or dangerous levels of a chemical because they are not immediately feeling the symptoms of that exposure. So with all this potential hazard, how do we protect employees and students from these hazards? How do we make you aware of these hazards? First off, These hazards need to be communicated through labels and material safety data sheets. Material safety data sheets are required to be provided by all manufacturers of any product that has any dangerous materials in it. They're required so that employees know how to protect themselves, so that they're aware of the hazardous materials in the workplace, and that they know how to use the chemical products safely. Product labels are required by federal law on any product that contains hazardous ingredients. They have to list who manufactured the product, what the dangers are, and who to call in case of a spill or in case of exposure. A material safety data sheet goes into much more detail than the label itself. The material safety data sheet will include what the chemical is, the manufacturer, the chemical properties, why it's hazardous, the type of hazard associated with using the chemical, and how to use the chemical safely. We're going to review a material safety data sheet for simple ammonia solution, something you could buy at your regular grocery store, something also that's very common in our laboratories. Something to keep in mind is that although material safety data sheets are required by federal law for all hazardous products, they are not required to look the same for all products. The information that has to be provided is spelled out in the OSHA regulations, but the order in which it is provided on the material safety data sheets is not required to be in a uniform order. So as we go through this MSDS for ammonia, keep in mind that as you look at other material safety data sheets, the information may be presented in a different order. Looking at this ammonia MSDS in section 1, we get the simple product identification. Something important to note is that many chemicals have multiple names. Ammonia is not as complicated as some others with synonyms, but there are many chemicals that go by many different names. Section 2 here lists the two ingredients in this solution, in this case simply ammonia and water. Some compounds can have many ingredients. Some also can have proprietary ingredients, and they are allowed by law to not list some of those ingredients if it is proprietary information. However, in the case of an injury, and the MSDS accompanies the injured person to the hospital, if the physician calls the manufacturer and says that they have an injured person, the manufacturer is required by law to tell that physician everything that's in that compound. That is why it is critical to have the material safety data sheet printed, ready to transport by EMS with the injured person during any experiment. Section 3 in this material safety data sheet talks about hazard identification emergency overview. It's telling you that ammonia is poison, it is a danger, it is corrosive. It causes burns to areas of contact. You have an ingestion hazard, you have an inhalation hazard, and it can be absorbed through the skin. Hazard ratings are meant to give you information on the different issues that you will encounter dealing with this chemical. Hazard ratings run on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being the least impact, 4 being a severe impact. And they include impacts on your health, flammability, reactivity, and contact ratings. These impacts give you an idea of what you need to do with relation to personal protective equipment, and also the severity of the chemical you're dealing with, and whether or not you should be actually working with this chemical or not. When you're dealing with lab protective equipment, all the material off the material safety data sheet needs to be considered. Do you need goggles and a shield, or just goggles? Lab coats versus aprons? Do you need to use a ventilation hood? And what types of gloves do you need to use for the chemical that you're going to be handling? Potential health effects need to be reviewed as well. You need to understand what the reactions are from the chemical you're dealing with if you become exposed via inhalation or ingestion, skin contact, eye contact, or chronic exposure. As a teacher, you have the potential for chronic exposure because you may teach this experiment 3 or 4 times a day or 4 or 5 times a year over the course of many years. So you need to look at chronic exposure potentials, not just acute exposure potentials. You need to review the first aid section on your material safety data sheets and understand what needs to happen for any of the exposures. The time to learn first aid responses for the exposures is prior to introducing the chemical into the classroom. You don't want to have an exposure happen in the classroom and then try to learn what you're supposed to do. You need to understand the first aid responses prior to that chemical coming into the classroom. Section 5 on this safety data sheet talks about firefighting. As you can see, ammonia is not considered to be a fire hazard. However, ammonia does give off flammable vapors, and the vapors may be explosive if it's mixed with air. Section 6 here deals with accidental release measures. I'm not going to discuss this in any great detail. This is more concerned with large spill releases, such as large quantities of chlorine or things like that that could potentially impact an entire neighborhood. Do be aware, though, that you could have some chemicals that are very dangerous that could impact a school and may require us to vacate a school if you would spill as much as a gallon of the material. Handling and storage, you definitely need to pay attention to the materials you have. Flammable cabinets may be necessary depending on what you have. Some acids required acid cabinets specifically. So pay attention to all your storage requirements depending on the chemicals that you may handle. Exposure controls need to be looked at. You need to be working with chemicals that do not require you to be in respiratory protection. We shouldn't be dealing with any chemicals that are that dangerous. Some chemicals, such as ammonia and bleach, can be handled under a ventilation hood without respirators. We are not set up to outfit students and teachers with respirators to deal with chemicals that dangerous. So read the material safety data sheets for the chemicals you are working with and make sure that they are not so dangerous that you have to have a respirator. Physical and chemical properties is simply a list of details of the chemical you're dealing with, appearance, odors, pH, things of that nature. Reactivity can be very important. This section will tell you what things not to mix your chemical with, or what things can happen if you do mix your chemical with other chemicals. If you look at the case of ammonia, you will see that it's incompatible with mercury, chlorine, calcium hypochlorite, several acids. React with hypochlorite, which is basically bleach. I think everybody knows at this point that you're never to mix ammonia and bleach. That does create a deadly gas, in addition to creating an explosive gas. You'll also get a toxicity section. that talks about carcinogens. If a chemical creates or is known to cause cancer or does other things such as mutagens or teratogens. You get into environmental information disposal. You will typically find that every material safety data sheet will simply tell you to refer to state and local regulations for disposal. I will tell you that you need to look at your Flynn science guidelines for chemical disposal, and if you are not sure of what you have to do for proper disposal, you need to contact my office. I take care of all chemical and hazardous waste disposal. I do not want you to dispose of anything in the trash or down the drain if you are not 100% sure that what you are doing is proper. Dealing with chemical transport is something that you folks do not need to worry about. I deal with that with hazardous waste shipments that we do at the end of the year with lab packs. Section 15 is simply additional regulatory information. Section 16 here provides just some more miscellaneous information, including the National Fire Protection Association ratings, which is a little bit of a repeat from the health hazard ratings we had earlier on this material safety data sheet. This is the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I do want to remind you that every chemical in your room needs to have a label on the bottle. If you transfer any chemical from the original bottle into a small beaker or small container, those containers and beakers need to be labeled at a minimum with the name of the chemical. There should be no unlabeled container anywhere in your storage room or in the classroom at any time. Thank you for your attention through this presentation, and this concludes your hazard communication refresher.